We'll shift gears here, and it's time to look at a developing story with Renita Young, senior markets correspondent here for the network. So, Renita, we know Hertz has had a busy week. We saw some pretty vast selling yesterday as they're moving away from EVs. Seems like the electrification process could be harder than they anticipated, but walk us through how this is playing out here.
Well, today we got the complete story, and Hertz and Tesla shares are falling today. Hertz says that it will cut about a third of its EV fleet, cutting specifically 20,000 Tesla vehicles, selling them off. And this is a stark reversal from back in 2021 when Hertz said that it would buy 100,000 Tesla vehicles. And at that time, Hertz wanted to add more EVs to its fleet, and it thought it would bring higher counter revenue and that these vehicles would hold their value. And later on in 2022, the CEO thought that EVs would become a big part of the turnaround strategy to lead Hertz out of bankruptcy. But Hertz is reversing that today, selling those 20,000 Tesla vehicles throughout the rest of this year and shifting back to gas-powered vehicles for several reasons. Tesla's price cuts lowered the value of EVs in the Hertz fleet and across the world, really. Hertz recorded higher costs from EVs in the second half of 2023. And then those higher interest rates and costs made many customers simply not want to buy Tesla vehicles anymore. And that led to slower growth. In fact, growth noticeably slowed in 2023, and you can tell that from the sequential decline quarterly. Now, sequential decline in growth quarterly. The sales increased just 1.3% in the fourth quarter. They increased just 5% in the third quarter, and then they increased about 15% in the second quarter. So that sequential decline, very noticeable there. Now, the company said that cutting the EVs in its fleet would actually increase free cash flow by between $250 million and $300 million, and that would be in 2024 and 2025.
You know, Renita, I think this is such an interesting story in some ways because it brings about many conversations, right? The EV shift to electrification, but also kind of like this overall discussion about how the economy is doing in terms of travel, in terms of companies like this, and some of the overhead that they deal with, some of the constraints ultimately that they face as the industry in general, in many ways, one could argue. But talk to me in terms of as a reflection of the economy. Many would argue that, well, we're in such a data-dependent environment, the Fed, us as investors, I would imagine this is going to kind of help them tip the scales one way or the other. Strengthen jobs, for example. We're all traveling. If we have, wages, we're earning significant money or consistently earning wages here. I mean, if labor conditions in the U.S., much like many of the other areas, the companies that we watch, if they were to start to falter, I'd imagine this would be one of those companies that we should watch very closely.
I would imagine too. And here's the thing. Consumers have choices, Ben. And so if we've seen anything over the past year, although we continue to see some strong data and other data that looked not quite strong, we saw where the consumer decided to spend their dollars. Even when we talk about travel in particular, consumers continue to travel. And not only that, they sprung for the premium tickets traveling. So it's really hard to say right now what direction that would go in when it comes to Hertz. However, we can be sure that consumers will choose what they feel is the best for them at the moment. Maybe it's luxury, maybe it's used cars, maybe it's new cars.
And as we know, Hertz is not one that's a stranger to some like woes, and I'd say maybe just volatility, as this company did file for bankruptcy back in May of 2020. So it's been like my example of like why bankruptcy doesn't mean that it's dire for a company. You can come back like Hertz, but I guess doesn't mean that your story is going to be necessarily completely perfect. We can still see some degrees of like where they're still figuring out this EV market, as I think a lot of these major companies are that are exposed to EVs. So we will leave it there. Really great breakdown on what has been a wild ride for Hertz just this week. Renita Young, senior markets correspondent here for the network.